A millionaire leaves a late-night business meeting exhausted and gets into his luxury car, eager to finally go home, when a child's voice urgently whispers behind him, "Mister, don't look back, they're following you." His heart races as he realizes there's a 7-year-old girl hiding in the back seat, her eyes wide with terror. With the early wisdom of someone who's lived on the streets, but the desperation of someone who's intercepted something dangerous, she reveals something that leaves him in pure shock. The rain fell in thin, icy sheets over the asphalt of Chicago, blurring the city lights into impressionistic smudges. For Arthur, the drum of drops on the ceiling of the underground parking garage was an irritating thrum, an echo of his own exhaustion. The meeting had dragged on until dawn, a tug-of-war of egos and numbers that had drained his last reserves of energy. All he wanted was the silence of his mansion, the comfort of his empty bed, and the temporary oblivion that sleep would bring. At 52, Arthur had built an empire, but the price was a solitude that not even the most luxurious Persian rug could warm. He walked, his footsteps echoing on the empty concrete, his leather briefcase weighing in his hand as if it carried all his burdens. There was a vulnerability in him, an almost childlike trust in the people he chose to keep close, which brutally contrasted with the cutthroat business shark image he cultivated. He trusted his partner, his team, in a world he believed to be orderly and just, as long as one worked hard enough. Upon reaching his luxury sedan, the scent of new leather and the climate-controlled air welcomed him like a familiar embrace. He sank into the driver's seat, his aching body protesting. For an instant, he closed his eyes, his head throbbing. Today's business victory felt hollow, another brick in a wall that isolated him from the rest of the world. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine purred softly, a promise of escape. He was about to shift into gear when a whisper made every hair on his body stand on end. "Mister, don't look back." The voice was small, childlike, coming directly from the back seat. Arthur's heart pounded, hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mind, trained to analyze corporate threats, couldn't process it. A carjacking? A sick joke? He remained motionless, sweat beading on his forehead. "They're following you," the little voice continued, urgent and trembling, but with chilling clarity. "And if you turn around, they'll know I warned you." Panic gave way to a chilling terror. Slowly, as if his muscles were made of glass, he raised his eyes to the rearview mirror. The reflection showed only the dark interior of the car. But the girl must have sensed his movement. "I heard the bad men saying they're going to follow you home tonight. There are 3 black cars on the avenue waiting for you to leave." A child. There was a child in his car. A child talking about bad men in black cars. His first instinct was to dismiss the story as the fantasy of a scared little girl who had hidden there to shelter from the rain. But the conviction in her voice was undeniable. With his heart in his throat, he discreetly adjusted the side mirror, just enough to see the parking exit leading to the main avenue. And there they were, 3 dark sedans, triple parked, their lights off, almost invisible in the rainy night. They were an anomaly, a menacing presence that made no sense at all. His meticulously controlled world began to crumble. The girl, sensing his hesitation, pointed a tiny finger through the gap between the front seats towards a dark corner of the parking garage. "Look, mister, that man is watching us." Arthur followed the indicated direction. Near a support pillar, the silhouette of a man stood out, the glow of a cell phone briefly illuminating his face. He wasn't sheltering from the rain. He was watching. Suddenly, the man put away his phone and began walking towards them, his steps firm and deliberate. Fear seized Arthur, an overwhelming wave that propelled him to action. Without a second thought, he floored the accelerator, the tires squealing on the slick floor as the car shot towards a secondary exit, plunging into the uncertain night with his small, mysterious passenger. The car cut through the rainy night like a frightened blade. Arthur gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, his eyes fixed on the frantic dance of the windshield wipers. His mind, normally a sanctuary of logic and strategy, was now a chaos of panic and disbelief. He drove aimlessly, weaving through side streets and alleyways he barely knew, his heart hammering erratically against his chest. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was a potential threat, every shadow an lurking enemy. The silence inside the car was heavy, broken only by his ragged breathing and the soft sound of rain. The girl's presence in the back seat was a paradox, the source of his terror and at the same time his only apparent lifeline. He couldn't go home, couldn't go to the office, couldn't go to the police, not until he understood what was happening. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur was utterly lost. "Where are we going?" Her voice sounded again, small but firm, cutting through the fog of his fear. He didn't answer immediately, focused on a sharp turn that made the tires dangerously slide on the wet asphalt. I don't know, he admitted, his voice hoarse. The confession sounded strange in his own ears, a man who always had all the answers now adrift. "Who are you, girl? How did you get in my car?" "My name doesn't matter right now," she said, the wisdom in her tone far beyond her years. "I hid when the chauffeur opened the door to clean the car earlier. I needed to warn you." Warn. The word echoed in Arthur's mind. Warn about what? About bad men and black cars? It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, not his real life, his life of spreadsheets and conference calls. He saw a main thoroughfare ahead, a path he knew well, a route that would take him to a busier and, he hoped, safer part of the city. It was an overpass, a vital artery that would pull him out of that web of unknown streets. The decision was instantaneous. He needed familiar ground. As he began to turn the wheel to take the on-ramp, a sharp cry paralyzed him. "No, don't take that street!" The desperation in her voice was so visceral, so genuine, that Arthur reacted purely on instinct. He swerved the wheel in the opposite direction at the last second, the car screeching tires and speeding past the overpass entrance, continuing along the dark, less inviting bypass. His heart seemed to have stopped. "Why?" he managed to yell, frustration and fear overflowing. The girl had her face pressed against the rear window, her small body tense. "They said they were going to block the exit on the other side," she gasped. "They knew you were going to take that way." Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror, the angle now allowing a clear view of the on-ramp he had almost taken. In the gloom of the night, dark figures emerged from the shadows, positioning themselves in the middle of the lane. They were men, blocking the passage, exactly as she had said. A chill ran down his spine, a terror deeper and more real than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't a fantasy, it wasn't a coincidence. The child in his car had, once again, predicted the danger with terrifying accuracy. He was being hunted, and that girl was the only one who seemed to know the rules of the game. The question that formed in his mind was as heavy as the night outside. Who was she, and how, in God's name, did she know all of this? The realization that the danger was real and meticulously planned hit Arthur with the force of a punch to the gut. The comfortable warmth of his luxury car now felt like a fragile cage, and the city he called home, a hostile labyrinth. He continued to drive, now following the girl's sparse but precise directions. "Turn here, mister! Don't go that way, there's too much light." She seemed to know the city from an angle he had never imagined, the angle of shadows, alleys, and escape routes. After what felt like an eternity of tense maneuvers, he found refuge on a quiet, dimly lit residential street, pulling the car under the canopy of a large tree that offered dark cover from the persistent rain. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Arthur tried to calm the trembling in his hands, his mind spinning, searching for a logical explanation. Finally, he turned in his seat, his body aching from the stress. For the first time, he truly looked at her. She was a small child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in worn clothes a little too big for her frail body. Her dark hair was tangled and damp, but her eyes were what held him. They were large and brown, and contained a mix of fear and a fierce determination that seemed out of place on such a young face. She didn't cry. She just watched him with an intensity that disarmed him. "Now, can you tell me," he asked, his voice softer than he intended, "how did you know all this? How do you know my name?" The girl hesitated, clasping her small hands in her lap. She looked away for an instant, as if pondering the weight of her words. "I see you sometimes," she began, her voice a whisper. "You pass by the plaza where I stay. Last week, you gave me some coins." The memory came to Arthur in a hazy flash. Yes, he remembered. A small street child huddled near a newsstand. He was late for a meeting, but something about her solitary figure moved him. He reached into his pocket and gave her the change he had, an automatic, almost unthinking gesture. He never imagined, not in his wildest dreams, that such a trivial act would have such profound consequences. "I heard them," she continued, her eyes meeting his again. "Not you, the bad men. They were in a coffee shop near the plaza. They spoke quietly, but I'm good at listening. They talked about the boss and the target. They talked about a rich businessman who trusted his partner too much." Arthur's blood ran cold. Partner. The word dropped like a stone into the pit of his stomach. Ricardo. His partner, his friend of over 20 years. The idea was absurd, unthinkable. "They said your name, Arthur," the girl said, and there was a sadness in her voice, as if she understood the pain her words would cause. "They said you were the target, that tonight they were going to follow you and make you disappear." The term made her shiver. "I didn't know what to do. I just thought, if I warned you, maybe you could get away. So when your car stopped in front of your building earlier, I waited and I hid." Arthur remained silent, the world spinning around him. Betrayal was a poison he had never tasted, and now it seemed he was being forced to drink the whole cup. His friend, his partner, the person he implicitly trusted. The devastating innocence of the girl's explanation was a knife in his chest. A gesture of kindness, a handful of coins, had planted a seed of loyalty in a tiny heart the world had discarded. And that loyalty had saved him, for now. He looked at the child in the back seat, no longer an intruder, but an unlikely guardian angel. He felt a knot in his throat, a mix of gratitude and overwhelming dread. Protecting himself was one thing, but now he held another life in his hands, and the bad men knew there was a witness. The girl's revelation, so direct and devoid of malice, left Arthur in a state of profound shock. Ricardo, the image of his partner, the best man at his failed wedding, the man with whom he had built an empire from the ground up, the friend who had comforted him in his darkest moments, fragmented in his mind. It was a betrayal so monumental that his brain refused to fully accept it. He searched for flaws in the child's story, for any hint of fantasy, but the memory of the black cars and the men blocking the overpass was a terrifying anchor of reality. He needed a safe place, a place where he could think, where he could protect himself, and now this small guardian. His mansion was out of the question, the office compromised, hotels were too exposed. Then a memory surfaced, a small pied-à-terre. He kept downtown, a secret refuge for when he needed to work late without the long commute home. No one, not even Ricardo, knew of its existence. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "I know. A place. It's safe." He started the car again, driving with double caution, checking his rearview mirrors every few seconds. The girl, who he now knew was named Lena, having heard her whisper to herself, remained silent in the back seat, a small but immensely significant presence. Upon reaching the old but well-maintained building, Arthur led her inside, his heart still pounding. The apartment was impersonal and functional, furnished with the essentials, but that night it felt like the safest sanctuary in the world. As he triple-locked the door, Lena explored the small space with curious eyes. She touched the texture of a leather couch, looked out the window at the city lights at a safe distance, and finally stopped in front of the refrigerator. Arthur realized with a pang of guilt that the girl must be starving. He opened the fridge, finding only water, a few cans of soda, and a jar of olives. His pantry wasn't much better. "I'm sorry," he said, embarrassment weighing in his voice. "I don't usually keep much food here." Lena merely shrugged, a gesture that seemed to say she was used to far less. "It's okay, Arthur. I'm not hungry." But her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. The sound, so common and human, broke some of the night's surreal tension. Arthur felt a wave of protective responsibility wash over him. He wasn't just a man fleeing unknown enemies. He was the guardian of a vulnerable child. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone," he ordered, grabbing his wallet. "I'm going to the convenience store on the corner. I'll be back in 5 minutes." Lena nodded, her large eyes fixed on him. There was a trust in them that both scared and strengthened him. Descending to the street again, the cold night air seemed to clear his head a bit. He bought sandwiches, juice, chips, and a chocolate bar, feeling strangely paternal. But on the way back, paranoia settled in again. What if they had followed him? What if they were waiting? He entered the building with a pounding heart, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and opened the apartment door with silent urgency. Lena was exactly where he had left her, sitting on the couch, her little legs dangling. The relief Arthur felt was so intense, it made him dizzy. He handed her the bag, and the way she took the sandwich, with an almost reverent delicacy, broke his heart. As she ate, he watched her, and the question he had been avoiding finally surfaced. "Lena," he began, his voice soft, "where's your family, your mom, your dad?" Lena stopped chewing. She swallowed the piece of bread with difficulty and looked at her own hands. "My mom. She got sick," she said, her voice suddenly fragile. "They took her to that big public hospital. It's been a long time, almost a year." She raised her eyes to him, and the innocence in them was devastating. "She told me to wait, that she'd come back, but she never did." The simplicity of that tragedy, the loneliness of a child waiting for a return that never came, hit Arthur harder than any threat. His own solitude seemed a selfish luxury by comparison. And then she added something that reopened all his wounds. "The bad men said you have a lot of money, and that other people deserve more than you." Lena's words, "Other people deserve more than you," echoed in the silence of the apartment, heavy with the weight of cruel, calculated envy. It wasn't just a robbery, Arthur realized with a chill. It was personal. It was a twisted moral justification for a profound betrayal. The story of Lena's mother, lost in the impersonal labyrinth of a public hospital, added a layer of tragedy to the already surreal night. He looked at that child, a survivor forged by neglect and abandonment, and felt the ground of his privileged world tremble. For years, he had lived in a bubble of success, believing that competence and loyalty were universal currencies. Now, he saw the world's brutality reflected in the eyes of a girl who, with her pure and desperate kindness, had saved him. The first week in that apartment unfolded in a haze of fear and adaptation. Arthur, the man whose day was governed by an electronic calendar and efficient assistants, now measured time by the sunrise and sunset seen from the window. He became a recluse, buying food at odd hours, wearing a baseball cap and dark sunglasses. always looking over his shoulder. Lena, in turn, adapted to the new environment with impressive resilience. For her, having a roof over her head guaranteed food, and the constant presence of someone who cared was an unimaginable luxury. She asked for nothing, but her eyes sparkled at the sight of a cartoon on television or at the taste of strawberry yogurt. In this forced interlude, an unlikely bond began to form. Arthur found himself teaching Lena to tell time on a wristwatch and listening to her fragmented stories of life on the streets. Stories of fleeting friendships, small acts of kindness from strangers, and the constant fear of the night. He discovered in her a sharp intelligence and a survival instinct that humbled him. In return, Lena seemed to find in Arthur a figure of stability and security she had never known. She stopped calling him Mr. and began to use his name, Arthur, with a familiarity that warmed his heart. However, the sense of security was a fragile illusion. Arthur knew he couldn't hide forever. He needed to act. His business mind, so long focused on profits and expansion, now turned to a strategy of survival. The first and most logical option was the police. Despite what Lena had heard about his partner, he still believed in the integrity of institutions. He needed professional help to unravel this conspiracy. With extreme caution, he used a burner phone he bought with cash to research the nearest financial crimes division. He didn't want to go to just any precinct. He needed specialists. After much deliberation, he decided it was time to take the first step to regain control of his life. He left Lena with strict instructions not to go out and not to answer the door to anyone, promising to return as quickly as possible. Upon arriving at the precinct, an imposing building of concrete and glass, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope. He asked to speak with the detective in charge. After a long wait on an uncomfortable bench, he was led to a spacious room. Behind a solid mahogany desk, a middle-aged man with a polished smile and a firm handshake introduced himself as Detective Moraes. Arthur began to tell his story, omitting Lena's existence to protect her. He spoke of the cars, the pursuit, his suspicions of a possible corporate conspiracy. The detective listened attentively, taking notes and nodding in understanding. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Viana," he said at the end, "especially against a man with the reputation of Ricardo Antunes." Arthur felt a chill. "You know, him?" Detective Moraes smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ricardo, of course. We're old friends. We play golf together on Saturdays. An exemplary family man, a brilliant businessman." He leaned forward, his tone now paternalistic and slightly condescending. "Arthur, with all due respect, you've been under a lot of stress lately, haven't you? Big deals, a lot of pressure. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." He pulled a business card from his drawer. "I know an excellent therapist. Perhaps talking to someone could help clear things up." Arthur froze, the words stuck in his throat. The air in the room seemed to thin. The friendship between the detective and Ricardo wasn't just an obstacle, it was a wall. The conspiracy wasn't just external, it had infiltrated, contaminated the very systems that were supposed to protect him. He took the card with a trembling hand, the paper seeming to burn his skin. He wasn't a victim seeking help. In the eyes of the law, he was already being painted as an unstable man, on the verge of a breakdown. The trap was far more sophisticated than he imagined. Leaving the precinct was like emerging from a dive into icy waters, breath short and mind hazy. Detective Moraes' condescending smile was etched in Arthur's memory, overwhelming proof that he was utterly alone. Ricardo's betrayal wasn't just an act of greed, it was a complex web, with threads extending into the city's power structures. The suggestion of therapy, the casual mention of Saturday golf, everything was calculated to disarm him, to plant the seed of doubt about his own sanity. He walked through the streets without truly seeing them, the traffic noise a distant the paranoia, which had once been an uncomfortable suspicion, now became his constant companion, whispering in his ear with every strange face, every car that slowed beside him. He wasn't just being hunted, he was being discredited. Returning to the apartment and seeing Lena's expectant face was a jolt of reality. The pure, simple trust in her eyes was a painful contrast to the duplicity he had just encountered. How could he explain to her that the police, the good guys, were on the side of the bad men? He couldn't. He merely forced a smile and said that things were being resolved, a lie that weighed on his conscience. That small refuge, once a sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a prison. The responsibility for Lena weighed on him in a new and terrifying way. Keeping her there, hidden from the world, wasn't a sustainable solution. She needed a proper environment, other children, and education. Driven by a mix of despair and a growing sense of duty, Arthur spent the next few days researching children's shelters. He used public library computers, paying cash to leave no digital trails. He needed a discreet, safe, and above all, trustworthy place. After an exhaustive search, he found one that seemed promising. Haven House, a small, family-like institution run by a kindly-looking woman, Mrs. Elvira, whose photos on the institution's website conveyed warmth and dedication. It seemed far enough from Ricardo's circle of influence. The conversation with Lena was one of the hardest of his life. He tried to explain that this was a temporary place, a safe spot where she could stay while he sorted out some adult problems. Her eyes filled with a silent sadness that broke him inside. "Are you going to leave me there? Like my mom?" she asked, her voice a trembling thread. "No, Lena, never," he promised, his heart aching. "I'll visit you. I'll pick you up as soon as all this is over. It's a promise." The visit to the shelter was clandestine. He took her in a ride-share car, paying cash and getting out 2 blocks early so as not to be seen. Mrs. Elvira greeted them with a welcoming smile. But Arthur, now hardened by distrust, analyzed every gesture, every word. Still, the place seemed genuine. Children were playing in the courtyard, the smell of baking cake wafted from the kitchen, and the walls were decorated with colorful drawings. Leaving Lena there was like tearing a piece out of himself. Her hug was quick but tight, and as he turned to leave, he felt an overwhelming emptiness. He returned to his mansion for the first time in over a week. He needed clothes, documents, and foolishly, a glimpse of his old life. The house was silent and cold, a mausoleum of his success. But something was wrong. The library door, which he always kept locked, was ajar. A chill ran down his spine. He entered slowly, his heart in his mouth. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but his eye, trained for detail, noticed the anomalies. A book, slightly out of place on the shelf, the pen on his desk, which he always left aligned with his notepad, was crooked. His instincts screamed. He began a frantic search, and what he found confirmed his worst fears. Behind a painting, hidden in the wall, a small listening device blinked a tiny red light. Another was under his desk, and upon checking his personal files, he saw that the clasps of confidential folders had been subtly forced and resecured. Documents had been photographed. His privacy had been systematically and professionally violated. They weren't just following him. They had been inside his home, inside his life for weeks. The air seemed to flee his lungs. The sense of violation was suffocating. And then his cell phone, his personal cell phone, which he had left behind, rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. A distorted electronic voice sounded from the other end, cold and emotionless. "We thought you'd like to know your little friend is making new friends. Very helpful social workers picked her up from the shelter tonight. A shame you weren't there to say goodbye." The electronic voice on the phone was like an icy punch to his chest, freezing the blood in his veins. Social workers. The lie was so blatant, so cruel, that for an instant Arthur couldn't breathe. Lena. They took her. The image of the girl's scared face, her trust in him, his promise to return. It all shattered into a million fragments of guilt and terror. He had put her in danger. He, in his foolish attempt to protect her, had delivered her directly into the hands of his enemies. The silence on the line was torture, a calculated void designed to let him absorb the full impact of that violation. The invasion of his home, the listening devices, all of it became secondary. A child's life was at stake because of him. "What do you want?" he managed to say, his voice a low, trembling growl, an impotent fury bubbling beneath the panic. "It's good to see we're finally on the same page, Arthur," the distorted voice continued, savoring each syllable. "No police, no heroes, just business." There was a pause. "Your partner, Mr. Antunes, is very concerned about your mental health. He's prepared some documents to ensure the company remains in good hands while you take some time to recover. A transfer of control, simple, clean, blackmail." The word exploded in his mind. They were using Lena, using the bond he had formed with her, as the vilest of weapons. His growing affection for the girl, his kindness, had been twisted into his greatest vulnerability. "The girl is fine," the voice added, as if reading his thoughts. "For now, she'll stay that way as long as you cooperate. A lawyer will contact you tomorrow with the details. Sign the papers, Arthur. It's best for everyone." The call ended. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. Arthur stood in the middle of his invaded library, the cell phone still pressed against his ear, the world collapsing around him. They had anticipated his every move. The visit to the police, which only served to paint him as unstable. The search for a shelter, which led them directly to Lena. They weren't just reacting. They were ahead of him, manipulating him like a pawn on a sick chessboard. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. He looked around at the symbols of his success, the rare books, the works of art, the expensive furniture, and everything seemed grey and worthless. A cold, lucid rage began to replace the panic, a rage against Ricardo, against the corrupt system that protected him, and most of all against himself. He had been naive, too trusting, a dinosaur in a world of predators. But this rage also ignited a spark. They thought they had him cornered, that they could control him through fear for Lena's safety. But they underestimated one thing, the depth of the protective feeling he now felt for that child. She was no longer a stranger, an accidental responsibility. She had become his anchor, his purpose in that storm. He would not sign anything. Giving up his empire would be the same as signing his own death warrant and abandoning Lena to her fate. He needed to fight, but how? He had no allies, no reliable resources. He was completely isolated. It was then, amidst the despair, that his gaze fell upon a small wooden box on his desk, a gift from an old mentor many years ago. Inside it, there was an old faded business card. The name belonged to a man he hadn't seen in almost a decade, Daniel, a former investigative journalist who had become a private detective, a man who operated in the shadows, who distrusted authorities, and who was known for his fierce loyalty and unorthodox methods. It was a shot in the dark, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. With trembling hands, he picked up the card. It was time to stop running and start hunting. He was no longer just the victim. He was the only one who could uncover the truth and save Lena. The decision solidified in his heart, a silent but seismic turning point. He would no longer play by their rules. He would create his own. The fear was still there, an icy knot in his stomach, but now there was something more, a steel determination. He picked up the burner phone, took a deep breath and dialed the number on the card. The hunt was about to change direction. The voice on the other end of the line was exactly as Arthur remembered, hoarse, skeptical, and with a tone that had seen it all. Daniel speaking. Daniel, it's Arthur Viana. I don't know if you remember me. There was a pause. Viana, the king of the corporate empire. I remember. Thought you only dealt with sharks in suits, not small fry like me. There was a hint of irony in the voice, but no hostility. I need your help, Arthur said, urgency overflowing in his voice. It's complicated and dangerous. Another pause, longer this time. Arthur could almost hear Daniel on the other end, lighting a cigarette, assessing the situation. Complicated and dangerous is my specialty. Where and when? They arranged to meet the next night at a cheap, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, a place where Arthur Viana's face wouldn't be recognized. During the day of waiting, Arthur lived in a state of feverish anxiety. The call from Ricardo's lawyer came as promised, an unctuous voice explaining the necessary procedures for the transition of power, while Arthur recovered from his acute burnout. Arthur listened in silence, passively agreeing, buying time. Every word was a knife in his chest, a reminder that Lena was somewhere, scared and alone, serving as collateral. The meeting with Daniel was a reality check. The former journalist was older, grayer, but his eyes still held the same penetrating intensity. He listened to Arthur's entire story, from the whisper in the car to the blackmail call, without interruption, his face an impenetrable mask. When Arthur finished, the detective took a long drag from his cigarette and slowly exhaled the smoke. Your partner isn't playing games, Daniel finally said. This isn't a business bluff. It's a psychological warfare operation. They don't just want your money. They want to destroy you, erase you. I know, Arthur replied, but they have. The girl, I can't do anything that puts her in more risk. You're wrong, Daniel countered, leaning across the table, the intensity in his eyes growing. That girl's only chance is for you to fight. If you give in, they have no reason to keep her safe. She's a witness, a loose end. Daniel's words were brutal, but true. The foolish hope that cooperation would guarantee Lena's safety crumbled. Despair threatened to engulf Arthur again, but Daniel's steady gaze anchored him. So what do we do? Arthur asked, the word we sounding strange and comforting. First, we find out who's on his team. You gave me the detective. That's a start. But an operation like this needs more people. Muscle, surveillance, maybe even someone inside your company. Second, we find the girl. They must be holding her somewhere discreet, but accessible. And third, and most importantly, we turn the tables. They're trying to prove you're crazy. We're going to prove they're criminals. In the days that followed, Arthur plunged into a world he never knew existed. Under Daniel's guidance, he learned to move through the city like a ghost, to use technology to protect himself instead of being monitored, to think like his enemies. Daniel, with his network of contacts in the city's dark corners, began to pull at the threads of the conspiracy. He discovered that the social workers who took Lena were known enforcers, hired by a shell security company that in turn was owned by a cousin of Ricardo's. Each discovery was another layer of betrayal revealing itself. While Daniel investigated the outside, Arthur focused on the inside. He sifted through his memories, re-examining conversations, meetings, emails exchanged with Ricardo over the past months. He began to see a pattern, subtle suggestions from Ricardo for him to take vacations, concerned comments to other board members about Arthur's fatigue, business decisions that, in retrospect, seemed designed to isolate him. The betrayal hadn't started on that rainy night. It had been seeded for months, perhaps years, right under his nose. The pain of this realization was deep, but he channeled it into a cold determination. One day, while sifting through old papers, in his secret office in the pied-à-terre, Arthur found something he had forgotten, a small sketchbook he had bought for Lena during the week they spent together. He flipped through it, his heart aching. Most pages contained childish scribbles, but on the last page there was a drawing that made him stop. It was a crude drawing of a building with a large red antenna on top, and next to it, an ice cream cone with one pink scoop and one brown scoop. It didn't make sense. It just looked like a child's drawing. But then he remembered something Lena said while drawing. That's where the man with the mustache took the other man who didn't want to pay. The ice cream there is good. At the time, he paid no attention. Now, the words echoed in his mind. Man with the mustache. One of the enforcers Daniel identified had a prominent mustache. Could it be a clue? A place where they took people? A building with a red antenna and an ice cream parlor nearby? Hope, fragile and desperate, surged in his chest. Could that child, even in captivity, have found a way to send him a message? Lena's drawing became Arthur's obsession. He photocopied it, enlarged it, and spent hours staring at those childish lines, trying to decipher the enigma. A building with a red antenna and an ice cream parlor. In the vast metropolis of Chicago, there could be hundreds of such places. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, but it was the only concrete clue they had about the girl's whereabouts. Daniel, initially skeptical, was convinced by the intensity of Arthur's belief. Lena's intelligence and observational skills had already been proven. It wasn't impossible that she had left a deliberate message using the language she knew, that of drawings. Together, they began a meticulous and exhaustive effort. They cross-referenced city maps with satellite images, looking for buildings that fit the description. The red antenna criterion was the most distinctive. They focused on old radio towers, commercial buildings with painted cell phone antennas, and even old factory smokestacks. For each potential location, Daniel used his contacts to check ownership and recent activity, while Arthur, disguised, conducted a preliminary reconnaissance, looking for the second part of the clue, the ice cream parlor. Days turned into a week, then almost two. Frustration began to set in. They investigated dozens of locations, from abandoned warehouses in the industrial zone to dilapidated apartment buildings downtown. Each false lead was a blow to Arthur's hope, increasing his sense of guilt and urgency. Each night, he lay exhausted, the image of Lena's trusting face haunting his dreams. He clung to the promise he had made her, a silent mantra that kept him from giving up. During this time, Ricardo's pressure increased. The lawyer's calls became more insistent, the veiled tone of threat more explicit. Arthur, time is running. Outpatience has its limits. Arthur continued to stall, using flimsy excuses, knowing that every day gained was one more day to find Lena. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Daniel was talking to an old informant, a hacker who owed him a favor, casually showing him the drawing. The hacker looked at the red antenna and laughed. "That's not an antenna," he said. "That's the old logo for Electromart, an electronics chain that went bankrupt in the 90s. They had that red antenna on top of all their warehouses. Most were torn down, but I think there's still one standing over in the Riverbend Industrial Park." Arthur's heart pounded. Riverbend Industrial Park, a mixed area of old industrial warehouses and new real estate developments. It was the perfect kind of place to hide someone without attracting attention. With trembling hands, he searched his phone's map. And there it was. A large old warehouse, listed as property of a shell company linked to Ricardo's cousin. And less than 100 yards away on the street out front, a point on the map indicated Sweet Treat Creamery. The relief was so overwhelming that Arthur felt his legs weaken. It was there. It had to be there. Lena's cunning was extraordinary. She didn't just draw what she saw, but used a specific detail, the ice cream parlor she had associated with a previous event, to confirm the location. That same night, under the cover of darkness, Arthur and Daniel went to the location. The warehouse was an imposing, decrepit structure with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. It looked abandoned, but Daniel, with his night vision binoculars, pointed to a window on the upper floor. There was a faint light on, and the outline of a curtain that didn't match the abandonment of the rest of the building. There was also a black sedan discreetly parked in an alley beside it, identical to those that had pursued him. They couldn't simply storm in. It would be suicide. They needed a plan. Proof. As they watched, the side door of the warehouse opened, and two men stepped out to smoke. One of them was the man with the mustache Lena had mentioned. The other, Arthur recognized with a shock. It was his own company's head of security, a man named Marquez, whom he had trusted for years. The web of betrayal was even wider than he imagined. As they watched, Marquez answered his cell phone. Daniel, using a long-range directional microphone, managed to pick up fragments of the conversation. The words were muffled, but some stood out clearly. Tired of waiting, the boss said if Viana doesn't sign by Friday to take care of the girl, no loose ends. Friday. It was Wednesday. They had less than 48 hours. Time had run out. The desperate search for the truth had turned into a race against death. The image of Lena, her smile, her courage, flooded Arthur's mind. He wasn't going to fail her, no matter the cost. The revelation that Marquez, his head of security, was involved was the final piece of the betrayal puzzle. Arthur's trust, already in tatters, disintegrated completely. It wasn't just his partner, it was his inner circle, the people to whom he delegated his safety and well-being. The threat of taking care of the girl transformed Arthur's fear into a cold, calculating fury. The Friday deadline hung over them like a guillotine blade. There was no more time for subtle investigations or for gathering conventional evidence. They needed to act, and fast. "We can't go to the police," Arthur said, his voice firm as they pulled away from the warehouse. "Detective Moraes will simply tip them off." "And we can't go in there by force," Daniel agreed. "There are at least 2 enforcers, probably armed, and we don't know how they're keeping the girl. Any direct confrontation puts her at extreme risk." They returned to the pied-à-terre, the air heavy with the urgency of the situation. Arthur paced, his mind working at high speed, no longer like a businessman, but like a general planning a desperate battle. Ricardo's strategy was clear: isolate him, discredit him, and pressure him into yielding. Arthur realized that the only way to win was to use the enemy's own tactics against them. He needed to break the isolation, create irrefutable proof, and expose the conspiracy in a way that even Detective Moraes couldn't ignore. "They want me to look crazy, paranoid," Arthur said, stopping suddenly. "What if we give them exactly what they want?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm going to call Ricardo," Arthur explained, an audacious plan beginning to form. "I'll sound like a broken man at the end of his rope. I'll agree to sign the papers, but I'll impose a condition. I'll say I'm scared, that I don't trust lawyers or formal meetings. I'll insist on delivering the documents personally." "To him, and only to him. He'll never agree," Daniel said. "It's too risky for him." "He will," Arthur insisted. "He's arrogant. He believes I'm defeated. The chance to see me humiliated, to receive the company from my own hands, will be irresistible to him. It will be the apex of his victory. And that's the arrogance we'll use." The plan was dangerous, full of variables, but it was the only chance to draw Ricardo out of his comfort zone and get the proof they needed. The objective was simple and terrifying: to make Ricardo confess. Arthur spent the next few hours rehearsing. He needed to sound convincing, a mix of desperation, fear, and resignation. The call was the performance of his life. He stammered, his voice trembled. He spoke about not being able to take the pressure anymore, about just wanting it all to end. As predicted, Ricardo initially hesitated, suggesting that the lawyers handle everything, but Arthur insisted, adding the final touch. "I just want to be sure that my goddaughter will be okay," Arthur said, using a term that implied a pre-existing bond and faking an emotional vulnerability. "If I hand everything over to you, Ricardo, I need to hear from you that she'll be safe." There was a long pause on the line. Arthur held his breath. The bait had been cast. "All right, Arthur," Ricardo's voice finally came, coated with false compassion. "If that's what you need for peace of mind, we'll meet tomorrow night, at your office, just the two of us." They had done it. Ricardo had taken the bait. Now came the hardest part. Daniel used his skills to set the stage. He installed miniature microphones and cameras in Arthur's office at the company, a place Ricardo would consider safe and under his control. They worked through the night, moving like thieves in a building Arthur owned, which was a bitter irony. While Daniel prepared the technical trap, Arthur prepared for the emotional battle. He knew confronting Ricardo face to face would be the hardest thing he had ever done. He would have to look into the eyes of the man who had been his best friend and see a monster. He would have to control his rage, his pain, and guide him towards a confession, all while Lena's fate was at stake. The following night wouldn't just be about saving his company or his reputation. It would be about saving a life and, in the process, confronting the darkest face of human betrayal. He looked at Lena's drawing, now kept in his wallet like a talisman. She had been brave for him. Now it was his turn to be brave for her. The night of the meeting arrived with palpable tension. The air felt electric, charged with the weight of what was to come. Arthur put on one of his expensive suits, but it felt like a costume, armor that couldn't hide his vulnerability. Every minute of waiting was torture. Daniel was in a van across the street, monitoring the audio and video, a technological and invisible guardian angel. They had only one chance. If something went wrong, if Ricardo suspected, the plan would crumble, and the consequences would be unimaginable. When Ricardo arrived, he was the picture of solicitous concern. He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, the gesture a desecration of the friendship they once shared. "Arthur, my friend, I'm glad you've made the right decision. It's for your own good." Arthur felt a wave of revulsion, but forced himself to appear fragile and defeated. "I just want this to be over, Ricardo. I can't take it anymore." He led Ricardo into the office, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cameras and microphones were invisible, but to Arthur, they seemed to scream their presence. They sat down, the large mahogany desk between them like an abyss. Ricardo pushed a folder with the documents across the table. "Just sign here. Arthur, and all this ends. You can rest, get treatment. I'll take care of everything." Arthur looked at the papers, the proof of his planned ruin. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling on purpose. "Before I sign," he began, his voice choked. "The girl, Lena. I need to know she's safe. Where is she?" Ricardo sighed, a sound of feigned patience. "She's fine, in a safe place. Once this is sorted out, she'll be transferred to appropriate social services. No one will get hurt." "That's not what your men said," Arthur retorted, introducing the first barb. "They said if I didn't sign by today, they were going to take care of her." Ricardo's smile flickered for a microsecond. "You must have misunderstood. Stress, paranoia, they're complicated things." "There was no misunderstanding, Ricardo," Arthur said, his voice gaining unexpected strength. "I heard the recording. Marquez, my head of security, talking to your enforcers, just as I heard you on the phone with Detective Moraes, planning how to commit me to a psychiatric clinic." Ricardo's face transformed. The mask of concern fell, revealing the coldness of a predator. You've been busy. I had a good teacher, Arthur said, thinking of Lena, one who learned to survive by listening in the shadows. He leaned forward, abandoning the charade. Why, Ricardo, 20 years. We built this together. Wasn't it enough for you? Why destroy everything? Why destroy me? Ricardo laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Enough? You never understood, did you, Arthur? You always had everything, the talent, the charisma, the Midas touch. I was always the second, the partner, the shadow. While you got the applause, I did the dirty work, dealt with the problems, cleaned up your messes. You with your blind trust, your naivete. It was an insult. I deserved this. I deserved more. The confession was more venomous than Arthur had imagined. It was a lifetime of resentment and envy. And the girl? Arthur pressed, his heart aching. What does an innocent child have to do with your inferiority complex? She was an unforeseen complication, Ricardo said with chilling coldness. Your mistake, as always, your stupid charity, but she ended up being useful, a lever to speed things up. He stood up, his patience exhausted. Enough talk. Sign the papers, Arthur, or I make a call and your little street friend disappears forever. And then I'll use these recordings you so stupidly mentioned to prove you're having a complete psychotic breakdown, harassing me and your employees. Either way, I win. Ricardo picked up his cell phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. The threat was real, immediate. Arthur felt panic rise. The plan had worked, the confession was recorded, but Ricardo still held the final card. He still had Lena. Arthur looked at the triumphant face of his former friend and knew he needed more than a confession. He needed a distraction. He needed a miracle. At the moment of greatest tension, when Ricardo's arrogance seemed unshakable, and his thumb threatened to seal Lena's fate, the unthinkable happened. The office door, which should have been locked, creaked softly open. The two men turned sharply, Arthur's heart leaping into his throat. Standing in the doorway, small and frail, yet with eyes gleaming with defiant courage, was Lena. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. Ricardo gaped, confusion and shock etched on his face. Arthur felt a wave of terror and relief so intense it left him breathless. How was she here? How had she escaped? Behind her, in the doorway, Daniel's figure appeared, silent as a shadow. In a quick whisper, while Ricardo's attention was focused on the girl, Daniel explained to Arthur. The hacker. Not only did he find the location, he infiltrated their security system, disabled the cameras and alarms. I went in through the back while you kept him busy. She'd been locked in a room, but she's smarter than them, used a paperclip to pick the lock. She was hiding in a closet when I found her. The ingenuity and resilience of that child were a miracle. Lena didn't wait to be rescued. She was rescuing herself. Ricardo recovered from the shock, his face contorting into a mask of fury. You little pest, he growled, taking a step toward her. Stay away from her, Arthur yelled, instinctively moving to place himself between them, his fear for Lena overriding any fear for himself. But Lena didn't back down. She took a step forward, her eyes fixed on Ricardo, and then she spoke, her voice clear and firm, echoing in the tense silence of the office. I heard you, she said. I heard everything. You said you were going to send Arthur to a crazy place. You said if he didn't give you the money, I'd disappear. She raised a trembling little hand and pointed at him. You're the bad man. The accusation, coming from a child who should have been his helpless victim, had a devastating power. It was pure truth, stripped of any adult complexity, and in that moment Ricardo broke. The facade of control, the arrogance, everything crumbled, replaced by raw panic. Shut up! He screamed, desperation in his voice. He knew he was finished. The recorded confession was one thing, but having the victim there, in person, articulating the crime, was another entirely. It was irrefutable. In a final act of desperation, Ricardo lunged not toward Arthur or Lena, but toward the table, trying to grab the signed documents and destroy any physical evidence. But Daniel, anticipating the move, was faster. He intercepted him, and the two men fell to the floor in a brief, clumsy struggle. Meanwhile, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder and louder. Daniel, before entering the building, had made an anonymous call to Internal Affairs, an internal police oversight body that investigates corrupt officers, reporting an ongoing kidnapping and the complicity of a detective, providing the address and the real-time audio recording as proof. Help was on the way, but not the compromised help of Detective Marias. Arthur rushed to Lena, kneeling and wrapping her in a tight hug. He felt her small, trembling body against his and was overcome by a wave of emotion so strong he could barely breathe. Gratitude, relief, love. She was safe. He had found her, or rather they had found each other. "You were so brave, Lena. So brave," he whispered into her hair, tears finally streaming down his face. "I knew you'd come, Arthur," she whispered. Back, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I left the clue for you." The sirens were now outside the building. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, sweeping across the office, where the truth had finally come to light. The nightmare was almost over. Looking at the girl in his arms, Arthur knew that his life, the life he had known, had ended that night. But a new one, richer and more meaningful, was just beginning. Internal Affairs' arrival was swift and efficient. They entered the office with professional precision. The scene they found: Ricardo subdued by Daniel, Arthur protecting Lena, and the audio and video recordings as silent witnesses, leaving no room for doubt. Ricardo and Marquez, who had been found at the warehouse, were arrested on the spot. The web of deceit, so carefully constructed over months, crumbled in a matter of minutes under the weight of truth. Detective Marias, implicated by the recordings and Ricardo's confession, was relieved of his duties the next morning, facing an internal investigation that would end his career. Justice, which had seemed so distant and unreachable, manifested with decisive force. In the days and weeks that followed, Arthur navigated the aftermath of the storm. There were depositions to be given, lawyers to be consulted, and a company to be restructured. But for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. The work which once defined his existence was now just a part of his life, not the whole. His perspective had fundamentally changed. The wealth he had strived so hard to accumulate seemed insignificant compared to the wealth of having Lena safe by his side. The bond between them, forged in fear and adversity, flourished in an environment of peace and security. Arthur immediately began the legal proceedings to become Lena's guardian, a process that, given the extraordinary circumstances, was expedited by the authorities. While the bureaucracy ran its course, he dedicated himself to a much more important mission: finding Lena's mother. With Daniel's resources and his own, Arthur launched an intensive search through the public healthcare system. The task was arduous, a dive into tangled records and the impersonal bureaucracy that had swallowed Lena's mother. Finally, after weeks of frustrating searches, they found her. Maria, Lena's mother, was admitted to a long-term rehabilitation facility in a neighboring city. She hadn't abandoned them. After a severe health crisis, she had suffered a collapse that left her unable to communicate or remember her own identity for many months. She was recovering slowly, but the path was still long. The reunion between mother and daughter was a moment of bittersweet, overwhelming beauty. Lena, who had lived almost a year believing herself orphaned and abandoned, could finally hug her mother. And Maria, seeing her daughter safe and well cared for, found new strength to fight for her recovery. Arthur, observing the scene from afar, felt a profound peace. He wasn't there to replace Lena's mother, but to support them, to ensure they had everything they needed to heal and rebuild their lives together. He arranged Maria's transfer to the best private facility in the city, ensuring she received the cutting-edge treatment she needed. He bought a comfortable apartment near the facility, a home for Maria and Lena, a place where they could start anew, free from fear and uncertainty. He didn't do it out of charity, but out of love. Lena and Maria had become his family. Daniel, the skeptical detective who operated in the shadows, also found a kind of redemption. Arthur's case reminded him why he had become a journalist years ago. To fight for the defenseless, to expose corruption. He refused an exorbitant payment from Arthur, accepting only his costs and a modest fee. Seeing the look on Ricardo's face when the police came in was payment enough, he said with a rare smile. The unlikely friendship between the mogul and the detective became a bond of mutual respect and gratitude. Arthur, the man who trusted blindly, learned his lesson the hard way. But he didn't become a cynic. Instead, he learned to differentiate naive trust from earned faith. He trusted Daniel, Maria, and above all, Lena. He sold his cold and impersonal mansion and moved to a smaller, cozier home, closer to Maria and Lena's apartment. His business empire continued to prosper, but now, under a new philosophy, one that valued people over profits. He became an active philanthropist, establishing a foundation to help street-involved children and families broken by the system. The pain and betrayal he suffered were transformed into a greater purpose. The darkness that almost consumed him gave way to a light he now shared with the world. 5 weeks had passed since that rainy night that turned Arthur's world upside down. Autumn gave way to a timid spring, and the city trees began to bud with new leaves, as if nature itself reflected the fresh start in their lives. Arthur drove his car, the same luxury sedan that had been the stage for so much terror. But the atmosphere inside it couldn't have been more different. The silence was no longer tense, but comfortable, filled by the soft melody of a children's song playing on the radio, and the sound of Lena's laughter in the passenger seat beside him, now properly seated in a booster seat. They were on their way to the facility to visit Maria, a daily routine that had become the highlight of their days. Maria's recovery was remarkable. With appropriate treatment and the motivation of having her daughter back, she progressed each day, her memory and strength gradually returning. The doctors were optimistic that, in a few months, she could be discharged. As he drove, Arthur passed the same overpass exit where, weeks before, he had swerved at the last second, saving their lives. He looked at the spot, now just a mundane stretch of asphalt under the afternoon sun, and a shiver ran down his spine, not of fear, but of profound gratitude. That night hadn't been the end of his life, but the beginning of his true existence. He who prided himself on his control had learned that true strength doesn't lie in controlling everything around you, but in surrendering to the bonds of trust and love. "What are you thinking about, Arthur?" Lena asked, her sharp perception. And as always, he smiled, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "I was thinking how brave you are. You saved my life, you know." Lena shrugged, a gesture that still held a remnant of her old life on the streets, but her eyes sparkled with pride. "You gave me coins when I was hungry, and you bought me a sandwich. You take care of the people who take care of you." The simplicity of that philosophy hit him hard. It was the most valuable lesson he had learned in his entire life, taught by a 7-year-old girl. True wealth wasn't in his bank statements or the value of his stocks, but in those small acts of human connection. It was in the warmth of Lena's hand in his, in Maria's progress, in Daniel's loyal friendship. It was in building a family not by blood, but by choice and extraordinary circumstances. Upon arriving at the facility, they found Maria waiting for them in the garden, her face illuminated by a genuine smile. Lena ran into her arms, and Arthur watched the two, feeling a contentment no corporate merger had ever given him. He was no longer just Arthur Viana, the millionaire. He was Arthur, the guardian, the friend, the protector, a man who found his soul by almost losing everything. Later, as the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, the three sat on a bench in the garden. Lena, nestled between Arthur and her mother, excitedly recounted her first day at the new school Arthur had enrolled her in. She was no longer the invisible street girl, observing others' lives from the shadows. She was the protagonist of her own story, a story of heroism and resilience. Arthur looked at Lena's happy face, at Maria's loving gaze, and understood the conclusion of his journey. Ricardo's betrayal had forced him to confront the loneliness of his life, and Lena's whispered warning in the dark of his car had been the call to awaken. The rearview mirror, which once reflected pursuers and threats, now reflected a bright and hopeful future. He had learned that the most important warnings, the most crucial truths, often come from the most unexpected and pure voices, and that, sometimes, a small act of kindness can return to you, not just to save your life, but to give you a reason to live it fully.